The fall of the USSR and end of the Cold War came at the end of 1991 and the Soviets lost everything. A last-ditch coup attempt to keep the Union alive failed and Boris Yeltsin became the first president of the Russian Federation, and he was coincidentally not the smartest leader to have during a transition period between communism and democracy, as Yeltsin really didn't know what he was doing and how to run a capitalist country, where he mostly just got drunk the whole time. Also, the US president during the 90s was Bill Clinton. He's gonna be bad news. Yeltsin believed that the best way to run the Russian economy after having communism destroy the country for 70 years and after a major recession was shock therapy, or the immediate privatization of everything. And as you can imagine, this went terribly as most people had no money and didn't understand how capitalism was supposed to work. You see, in 1990, the USSR had a very bad economic depression and hyperinflation was rampant. After the fall of the USSR, Yeltsin thought that shock therapy would stimulate the economy. Instead, what happened is that the Russian people were all given vouchers for owning shares of newly privatized industries. Shock therapy was really not well received by the Russian public, and as it worsened issues and contributed to the rise of Russian oligarchs. What came from shock therapy was a massive voucher scam where a few considerably wealthy and intelligent men would pay very little to ordinary Russians in exchange for their vouchers for shares in newly privatized companies. These men quickly became the wealthiest men in Russia, controlling all of the privatized government assets and only had paid pennies for them and left the Russian people very poor and plagued with hyperinflation and mass poverty. These men became known as the New Russians, and they were basically capitalism's worst-case scenario. Let's check in on America. In 1992, the U.S. had a three-way election between George H.W. Bush, who was brilliant on foreign policy but had the most stupid vice president of all time. There was also Ross Perot, who ran an independent campaign. And then there was the worst possible guy to have been elected president for Russia's well-being in this transition period. And that was Bill Clinton. Clinton had pretty much no foreign policy experience and figured the solution to most foreign affairs problems was economic sanctions to destroy the country's institutions and make the population suffer to attain regime change, or he felt that scaling things back by a lot and leaving unattainable goals was the right way to go. But by most accounts, he believed keeping Yeltsin in power at all costs was the correct status to do in Russia. And as you'll see in this video, that was the last thing that Russians needed. But the first thing that Bill Clinton did was cancel a U.S. aid package that Bush had worked his butt off to put forth in Congress and pass. The package was supposed to relieve the Russian economic situation as it had conditions and instructions on how to run a country. This package would have stopped a lot of the initial issues in Russia that quickly spiraled into making Russia the crap hole that it became. Anyway, Clinton decided to stop the package, but sent his own so-called experts to Russia to run the economy, and spoiler alert, that also went terribly. And that was all just the immediate things that Clinton did to Russia, and we will have a whole decade to go. Back to the Russian front, a lot of these new Russians transitioned either into mafia bosses or oligarchs. The rise of the oligarchs came with shock therapy and scamming ordinary Russians, and after a few short years, oligarchs had consolidated their own markets and industries. For example, one guy would own all of the electrical plants and another would own all of the steel manufacturing. Got it? Great. These oligarchs were so rich that they threw away money like it was nothing on useless things, and as you can imagine, these oligarchs became very politically connected, and that's called foreshadowing. Russia then had a constitution crisis in 1993 where democratic backsliding really started to begin. Yeltsin and his supporters clashed with parliament and its supporters, as well as several other extremist opposition groups that ranged with ideologies from monarchism and communism to neo-Nazis and National Bolshevism. But the point is that Parliament controlled the Russian White House, and there was quickly fighting between Yeltsin and anti-Yeltsin protesters. Also, Yeltsin's own vice president, Alexander Rudskoy, agreed with Parliament on the issues, and as you can imagine, Yeltsin didn't really like that very much. Bill Clinton then struck again with his lack of understanding of foreign affairs. He told Yeltsin to regain control over Parliament and that the U.S. is against any form of democratic backsliding. Yeltsin then took this as the okay for him to go in guns a-blazing and forcefully end the crisis with 147 left dead and over 400 injured. Despite the opposition being technically in the legal right with Parliament, Yeltsin projected himself as a defender of Russian democracy to the outside world while instituting a rule by decree. Another aspect to much of the chaos of the 90s in Russia was the exponential rise of the mafia. Organized crime controlled much of the streets in Russia and operated openly as corruption had skyrocketed. The Russian mafia's international drug trade and organized crime was one of only the few ways people made money in the 90s. Many people were hired as hitmen and contract killers, while others transported and grew drugs. But worst of all, the Russian mafia forcibly enslaved many people during this time. Regarding ordinary Russians, just about every business in Russia, from curbside vendors to huge oil and gas companies, made payments to the organized crime for protection known as the Krisha. Businessmen said that they needed the Krisha because the laws in the court system were not functioning properly in Russia. The only way for them to enforce a contract was to turn to a criminal Krisha, and most people wouldn't care otherwise. They also used it to intimidate competitors, collect debts, and take over new markets. It was also increasingly common for businessmen to turn to the red Krisha, or corrupt police who ran protection rackets. Within the system, there was a sharp rise in contract killings developing, which further led to ordinary Russians living in fear, as well as other markets consuming one another with criminal empires. With everything going so bad domestically in Russia, Yeltsin decided that now was the right time to launch a war in Chechnya. The First Chechen War started in December of 1994, where Chechnya declared official independence, and Yeltsin responded by invading the separatist region in the southern Caucasus. This might have looked like it should have been an easy victory for Russia, but the Russian military still had older Soviet outdated equipment, and oligarchs controlled funds that were supposed to go into the military, but instead it went back into their own pockets. The First Chechen War was a disaster and further devastated the Russian military's morale to a new low since the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. The war ended in August of 1996, and Chechnya retained its independence for now. The 1996 Russian presidential election initially saw Yeltsin polling very poorly and people believing that they could now vote in a newer and better president because democracy. However, the oligarchs, mafia bosses, and Clinton liked seeing Yeltsin in power, as oligarchs and mafia bosses continued to get richer while Clinton was just an idiot and thought that Yeltsin was protecting Russian democracy from democratic backsliding, when in reality it was kind of the opposite. But don't just think that Clinton rigged the election so Yeltsin wins. Clinton only provided funding for Yeltsin, which is stupid and a bit of a conflict of interest on its own. However, most of the fraud comes from oligarchs and stuff within Russia. The questionable election bit and fraud starts with the loans for shares scheme conducted by oligarchs and mobsters within the Yeltsin campaign. This scheme saw oligarchs loan money to the Yeltsin campaign in exchange for privatization of even more government assets and their ownership of said assets. To sum up loans for shares, these oligarchs are loaning money, not even giving money to fund Yeltsin, they are loaning it to Yeltsin. In exchange, they get even more government assets and even more control of what made them rich in the first place. Additionally, there was the Seven Baker scheme, which saw 7 powerful banker oligarchs fund Yeltsin, and in exchange, they would run part of the government from behind the scenes in his second term. There was also the Xerox affair, where 2 staffers were arrested by the Yeltsin campaign and interrogated, and it wasn't helped by the discovery of $500,000 where fraud allegations were thrown around over the campaign. It's also possible that the detention of the 2 was a result of a petty squabble about how to run the Yeltsin campaign. Anyway, the Yeltsin campaign also created a bunch of shell political parties to divide the vote as much as possible so that Yeltsin wins a majority compared to the rest of these shell political parties. All of this worked, and Yeltsin won a second term in 1996, but Yeltsin being absolutely wasted the whole time of his administration must have had an impact on Russian society in the 90s, as alcoholism and drug use heavily spiked. It also wasn't helped that the mafia continued to run wild and owned part of the government at the time, and it was common to see discarded drugs and bottles of alcohol around every bus station and sometimes around schools. I'll sum up Yeltsin's second term by saying it was a big continuation of his first term, but with even more oligarch control over the government, and you can probably imagine how that went. The Second Chechen War kicked off in August of 1999 and coincided with the 1999 war in Dagestan, where Chechnya was seen as more of a legitimate threat to Russians, as Chechnya had many radical terrorists committing attacks aimed at Russia. I won't continue going on with the Second Chechen War as it goes beyond the 90s and the scope of this video. On New Year's Eve of 1999, Yeltsin resigned and apologized to the Russian people for how bad his administration was, and his vice president, Vladimir Putin, became the second president of Russia. In conclusion, Russians were initially very hopeful for the transition into democracy, but Russia's chaotic 90s saw mass hyperinflation, a destroyed economy controlled by oligarchs, the mafia running rampant throughout the streets, massive democratic backsliding, an unpopular war, and a very naive Bill Clinton not understanding how to do foreign affairs. And all of these set the perfect conditions for Putin's presidency and Russian revisionism to take shape in the 2000s. And that is a summary of Russia in the 90s. I'll be doing a part 2 video where I discuss Russian revisionism from 2004 to 2022, and that will be out next week. Did you know about Russia's chaotic 90s before this video? Are there other aspects that I should have mentioned or talked more about? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.